Hey folks, I'm Jack Fossett and welcome to this demo, review, and tone tips video of the Fender 68 Custom Princeton Reverb reissue. Now first of all I want to say a big thank you to my friend Chris Sprague who loaned me this amp so that I could bring you all this video. I've been wanting to get one of these in my collection for a while, so kind of temporarily having it is just fueling my gear acquisition syndrome. Seriously, can we do better? We're guitar players. We play one of the most expressive musical instruments ever created, and the best we can do is third grade potty humor.
Get a gear acquisition syndrome? Gas? You know, you want to get more guitars, but it's like you're passing farts and things, and
so to start off, I want to say for this next part, I'm going to give you my thoughts on the amp, my review, as well as some tone tips and some of the best ways that I've found to use it. After that, we're going to get to more playing samples, and then stay tuned until the very end. You can hear the amp totally wide open with the volume turned all the way up. So let's get to it. This series of amps came out some years ago. They're on the newer side, but they've been around for a little while, and the idea of it is not that they're a reissue. Now, silverface Fender amps are generally not looked on with the same reverence that the blackface Fender amps are looked on. However, the silverface Fender amps are totally awesome, and actually, if you're looking for a vintage one, you can really get a vintage silverface amp for the same price as a newer amp. They're really cool. You can find some really good ones later on in the eras when you started to get up to the master volume ones. I don't care for those as much, but some of the early ones, and this one harkens back to 68 with the drip edge that's around the speaker cloth. They're actually really cool amps. Now, that being said, that's where the style and the inspiration comes from. However, this particular model is not a vintage reissue. What they're calling it is a hot rod tribute. So here's where some of the differences come in. You have a custom Schumacher transformer, not Joel Schumacher. You're not going to find bat nipples anywhere on this amplifier. You have a modified tone stack, and they've also reduced the negative feedback so that it will break up at lower volumes than the regular Princeton amps would. Now, this is something also with this amp that's going to be a little bit different from its big brothers in this same line. The other amps in this line they make are the Deluxe, the Vibrolux, and the Twin. Now each of those are two-channel amps, and the channels are voiced differently. You have your classic silverface sound on one channel, and then on the other channel it's actually kind of modeled after a Bassman, and it has much more tweed character, but still being able to use the reverb and tremolo. So for some of those bigger amps, if you ever really wanted to kind of find the perfect blend or hybrid, if you will, of a tweed amp and a blackface or silverface amp, those are great amps to look at. Now this one is just one channel, so you have that modified sound kind of in there, and with the modified tone stack and with the lower negative feedback, I think this amp sounds very, very tweedish. Is that a word, tweedish? Because it should be a word. I'm going to use it as a word. It's very tweedish sounding. I really, really noticed that with the EQ, and especially with the breakup. Not just the fact that it breaks up earlier, but also with the character of the breakup. The character of the breakup has more of that hairy edge of explosion kind of breakup like you would think from a tweed amp. That makes it really, really cool for recording, and it could make it cool for gigs, but it also depends on what you're looking for. So one question that I've gotten a lot from people when you talk about smaller tube amps like this is, can I gig with it? Well, the short answer is yes and no. That's not an answer at all. I realize that. Let me get to the point. You could play this amp live. First of all, you can play any amp you want live if you're mic'd. I mean, that's just, you can play tiny little things into tiny little speaker cabinets if you have a microphone in front of it and can put it through a PA. This one, if you want the pristine clean that a lot of people are going to come to expect from a Princeton Reverb, then I wouldn't take this to a gig where you're not going to be mic'd. The reason is because it's 12 watts with a 10-inch speaker. It gets loud, but when you're talking about band context, it's not really going to get loud enough with clean headroom. That's the caveat. And that's actually one of the big misconceptions about tube amps and volume, is wattage has more to do with clean headroom than it does to do with volume. And, you know, even the clean headroom, again, also has a lot to do with the circuit. Like this one, for instance, has lower clean headroom because of the negative feedback. So there's a lot going into it, but that would be my basic thing with this. You want to take it to like a blues gig, you know, in kind of your sort of typical club venue. Yeah, this thing would be awesome. You're going to get some really, really nice, warm, filled out blues tones with it. But if you really want that clean tone at a high volume, you can't get it without it being mic'd. Or you know, you could if you got one of the higher up models in this line, like if you decided to go with the deluxe reverb, which would then also give you kind of the cool thing of having the more traditional channel, but it wouldn't be as easy to get it to break up because even though it has the lower negative feedback, it is a louder amp, you know, with a bigger speaker. So this one, I think the best use for this amp is going to be if you want that bluesy tone, if you play small gigs and you're mic'd, or if you like to record. And that's actually one of the things I'm going to be using this amp to do some recording, because just the way that it fills up so quickly is really, really nice. Which brings me to my next point. This is one of the cool things about this amp at 12 watts and with lower negative feedback. You can really get the power tubes warmed up very, very quickly, so you can get cool tones at manageable volumes, which can be really good to record with if you want to get a really natural sounding overdrive and breakup without absolutely shaking the walls and everything. And this amp really delivers that. Now, the reverb and the tremolo are fantastic. They're everything that you would expect from, you know, Fender Blackface or Silverface amp. The reverb is very, very lush and very present. Now, I didn't find that the reverb had any harsh overtones really, like some, you know, lower end tube amps do, but it does get very, very washy and everything. Not to the point of complete ridiculousness, but it gets pretty heavy. And I'm going to show you one of the clips I'll show you later on is kind of how to get a cool surf tone out of this amp. Now, one of the things that surprised me on this amp, and now we're going to get into some tips on how to get the best sound out of it. There's a treble and bass. It's a 2-band EQ. Now, the bass seems to cover a lot of frequencies. That's one of the things that you get. Sometimes you get different types of, you know, tone circuits and everything. There's a lot of bass in this amp for such a small amp. Now, I did find that bass can kind of swell up a little bit, especially with how quickly the amp can warm up and fill out. You really don't need much bass at all on this amp. You know, a lot of these clips, I think the bass is down more around like, you know, in the 3 to 5 range. This is an amp that sounds good with both the treble and the bass at 5. I hate the whole knobs at noon thing. It's so boringly generic, but it sounds good on this amp. I would kind of be ready to turn that bass down a little bit because, you know, your natural inclination with a small amp is going to be to turn the bass up. But on this one, I found that bass to be really, really present, particularly with humbuckers. The treble, you have a nice range on. I don't think it gets ice picky by any means. I didn't really hear any harsh frequencies. However, it does get really bright. And again, with a smaller tube amp that's going to warm up quickly, when you turn a tube amp up, everything gets accentuated, and I've talked about this in other videos. So, you know, the treble gets more trebly, the bass gets bassier. It's not like it's just kind of this linear thing. So if you're playing with it at home and you've got this great, great sound, you need to be prepared to back off the EQ a little bit when you take it out live or get it to a higher volume. Because, you know, it's like, let's say you're playing with the treble at 7 and the bass at 5. It's a really, really nice sound. Maybe up to about 5 on the volume. Then when you start to turn that up, that treble starts getting sharper and that bass starts getting, you know, kind of more swelly. And it just, you need to be prepared to back off the EQ. That's kind of a general tip for most amplifiers, you know, tube amps especially. So be prepared to turn the EQ back a little bit further than you might like. Now, I've talked about this in other amp videos too. This is something that I really, really like. And again, it all goes back to the fact that it's an amp that kind of warms up and fills out quickly. The number 2 input. There's 2 inputs here. There's the 1 input and the 2 input. They are not the same thing. The 1 is a high gain input, the 2 is a low gain input. So when you plug into channel 2, you get not just low gain. Don't just think of it as low gain, because the character is slightly different too. It's a little less brash, there's a little more sag, the EQ's slightly mellower, you can sink into it a little bit more. Now, I am a big, big fan of that number 2 low gain input on amplifiers, and part of it is because I like kind of being able to sink into it as opposed to having the notes always right there, just like that. You know, I sometimes I want to be able to sink into it a little bit more. The other cool thing about the number 2 input, and I'm going to show this also, is, let's say, believe it or not, because some people, like myself, actually look for this sometimes. Let's say you don't really want a ton of gain, you want a clean that's filled out more. Because sometimes it's either like, in certain recording situations, depending on your amp and your setup and how you dial it in, but you know, you do find situations where the clean just doesn't have enough behind it, particularly if you're playing a single coil guitar. The clean doesn't fill out enough, and in order to get it to fill out enough, you really need to overdrive it, but you don't want gain, so what do? Well, with this amp, if you plug into the number 2 input, and then you can start to turn the volume up a little bit more, you can get the amp to fill out more, and it can fill out those notes, but without getting so much into the clipping stage. So I really like that, because it gives you a fuller, more present clean, but without getting into overdrive territory. Now again, be aware that if you want to use this to record, to drive it, in my opinion, this is just more sounding like a Tweed amp when you drive it. I think, you know, it doesn't quite have the, generally speaking, you know, those Tweed amps had this really fat, hairy kind of overdriven sound. You know, I think of Don Felder's solo on One of These Nights. It would almost sounds like a fuzz pedal, and it was actually just a cranked Tweed Deluxe with a Les Paul. That's kind of the Tweed sound. It has this sort of like, there's a bluesy quality to it, but there's also this slightly chaotic, sounding like it's about to explode quality to it. That's different from a blackface or silverface amp. Those I think of a smoother kind of bluesy distortion when they're pushed. So I will actually say this, I love this amp. I think this amp is really cool. But if you're really looking for the classic Princeton, you should go with the 65 reissue, the blackface one that they make. That is more of a dedicated Princeton. If you love Princeton amps, I think this is an excellent addition to your collection. But if you really want that kind of, you know, straightforward Princeton amp, then that would be the one for you. This one, I think, is more like a Swiss Army knife. And again, they say this right in the description. It's a hot-rodded tribute is the way that they describe it. Now, this one is all stock. They do make another version of this that also has a greenback speaker in it. Check out In the Blues. They just did a great review of that one with the greenback. And, of course, you can experiment with different speakers. I think the speaker that's in it sounds great, but I'm never opposed to experimenting with different speakers and kind of seeing how you can get different tones out of it. It does come with the classic foot switch, and again, the styling is very classic, you know, with the kind of block seafoam green letters. You know, you got the blue LED. It's a really flashy looking amp. There's kind of this blue twinkle in the grill cloth. Really, really clean, kind of great amp. So you're hearing it with 2 guitars. This is one of my favorite guitars. This is a heavily modified Fender American Standard Stratocaster. It has vintage style tuners. It has a Toneman guitar Eric Johnson wiring harness, and these are Lust for Tone 57 Lustcaster pickups. This is kind of my own little personal tribute to Eric Clapton, who's one of my very favorite guitar players, and has always been one of my biggest inspirations. And this has been a great guitar for me. I used this guitar a ton recording my last CD, which I'll put a link to below if you want to listen to it. It's called Shoreline, and you can hear this guitar quite a bit on there. I'm also using a Gibson ES-345. Now that one's all stock, and just to give you a, you know, kind of the difference in single coils and of course humbuckers and a semi-hollow, because I think a lot of people will want to use, you know, semi-hollow guitars with these amps. They really sound, that's a nice pairing. You know, you have an ES-339, or if you have an ES-335 or a 345, you can get some really cool old-fashioned blues tones. With the reverb combined with the Tweed, you can get some really, really neat, like B.B. King tones and Freddie King tones and all kinds of different King tones and things, and you know, these great old sort of blues tones. You can get great surf tones. Again, as I mentioned, we're going to to do some surf sounds with it using the reverb and the tremolo. And like I said, stick around until the very end if you want to hear this amp totally wide open. I'm going to do that with both guitars, plugging into the number 1 input with the volume all the way up at 10. Going to have the reverb and the EQ, you know, again, taken back a little bit on that one just because those things kind of get really, really big when the volume gets really, really big. And also going to play you a clip of this amp using a Tube Screamer at kind of a medium volume so that you can hear how it sounds with a boost overdrive kind of going into it. It's a standard Ibanez TS9. It's the same one that you'd get at any guitar store nowadays. Let me know what you think of this series, what you think of this versus the regular Princeton, if you have any experience with that, or versus other small tube amps. My name's Jack Fossett. Please remember to like, share, and subscribe, and we'll see you next time.